Did you know the US bans toxic pesticides at home, saying, uh-oh, these are too dangerous to be used on Americans, but then allows those very same pesticides to be exported all over the world, where those kinds of pesticides have caused widespread disease, birth defects, and even death. And there's actually a US law that explicitly allows this to happen.
Some of the largest, most powerful corporations in the world are involved.
And it's not just the US that does this, by the way. It's the UK and the European Union too. Just so you can get a sense of the scale of things, between 2015 and 2019, 42 countries received pesticides from the US with ingredients that are completely banned in the US. And most of those countries, 81% of them, are lower income countries.
San Roman has lung fibrosis. He blames it on pesticide spraying in Argentina's farm belt.
They took my life away. My life has been shortened.
Is this big companies in wealthy Western nations taking advantage of poorer countries around the world?
That's exactly what's happening.
There's so many examples. Paraquat, an herbicide so lethal that just a teaspoon of it can kill you. Banned in the EU, but exported all over. Chlorpyrifos, an insecticide that causes neurological damage in kids and is also banned in the EU, but is still being exported to poorer countries. Chlorothalonil, a fungicide banned in the EU for its links to cancer and groundwater pollution, but still sold around the world. And of course, the pesticide industry is raking in huge profits.
People are dying. Farmers are dying.
The most powerless people are the ones that have no say.
The workers in the field of the global south pay the price for the profit of the corporations that produce the banned pesticides.
So what's going on, and how can we stop this? I set out on a journey to find out, which led me to question one of the pesticide industry's biggest proponents.
Farmers are dying. This is a life and death situation.
It's not like the industry is holding the country at ransom and saying you must have this product. The country has leeway.
CropLife, they mentioned that, hey, this is the countries that are deciding that they want the pesticide. We're not holding a gun to them.
What the industry does is they infiltrate the process, taking advantage of the fact that the governments in a lot of these countries are so underfunded, they're so under-resourced.
This is a matter of injustice. For every soul that is lost, it is on them.
Okay, I think we're good here.
Doctors say the deaths are due to insecticide poisoning.
It's been banned in the UK and EU for years, but they still export it worldwide, where it has killed tens of thousands of people.
Hi, I'm Yara, and to get to the bottom of how on earth this is still happening, I headed to a UN-backed chemicals conference in Germany.
Let's go inside. Can we just go in?
That brings together stakeholders from all over the world. I quickly noticed there was one thing everyone was talking about.
Double standard.
Double standard.
Double standard.
Double standard.
So what exactly is the double standard?
What is deemed too dangerous for use in Europe is deemed okay for people in India, in Brazil, or in Argentina. That's really the double standard.
That's Laurent Gabarel from Public Eye. Their groundbreaking investigations have exposed the massive scale of banned pesticides that Europe is sending to lower income countries.
We did a mapping of 1 full years of exports from the European Union, 80,000 tons of banned pesticides that were exported that year, mainly to low-income countries. We're talking here about the most dangerous pesticides in the world, pesticides that were considered too dangerous for use in Europe. Paraquat, that's also a very strong example of the double standard.
Paraquat is that highly toxic weed killer I mentioned earlier, and it's banned in over 50 countries.
You've got Parkinson's disease. There is an excellent chance that you got it because you were around Paraquat.
Public Eye's research revealed that in 2020, the UK shipped over 10,000 tons of banned pesticides, including Paraquat, all over the world.
When I first learned that this was happening in the United States, I was blown away.
It's crazy, but it's perfectly legal. We have, in fact, in Europe, one of the strictest regulations in the world, but then there was no regulation that would apply to the international trade in banned pesticides. It's a loophole in the law.
Here in the US, it's not really about loopholes. Allowing companies to export banned pesticides is literally written into the law. Right here. No pesticide or device or active ingredient used in producing a pesticide intended solely for export to any foreign country shall be deemed in violation of this act. This means that as long as a company isn't making these toxic pesticides for use on Americans, so to speak, they're basically free to sell them wherever. Now, compared to the EU, the US isn't as transparent about releasing data on the banned or unregistered pesticides that it exports. And it doesn't ban anywhere near as many pesticides as the EU does. This is how many pesticides the US has banned? This is how many pesticides the EU has banned. It's also fallen behind India, Brazil, and China in banning some of the most harmful pesticides. But there are a few research papers that have been able to document what the US is up to. One older study showed that between 2001 and 2003, the US exported almost 28 million pounds of pesticides that it had banned domestically. A more recent study that I cited earlier showed that between 2015 and 2019, the US sent banned pesticides to 42 countries, 81% of which were low to middle income countries. And what's more, the research estimates that the vast majority of those 42 countries had a significant chunk of farm workers that, yes, were poisoned. So is there actually any safety net in place to protect people from these banned pesticides? Yes, but in our talks with industry experts, they don't seem that effective. First, let's talk about labels. Any banned pesticide that is exported from the US is required by law to have warning labels.
Warning, do not make your own labels as they may be backwards.
And pesticide companies will often point to these labels to argue that they're doing their part to ensure safety. This is an actual safety video from an organization representing the pesticide industry.
It is very important to be protected when applying pesticides. First things first, I never forget to read the label.
But multiple studies have shown that many farmers overseas can't even understand what the labels are saying, because it's in really technical language, or it's only in English, or the farmers sometimes just may not be literate.
Farmers who cannot read, they cannot be blamed.
That's Ahmed, a Nigerian chemical policy expert we met at the conference. He told us about how labels also get, well, lost.
Some farmers do not have enough money to buy, like 1 liter or a whole bunch of pesticide. They also sell them in bits by bits.
Ah, right. So then some other middleman basically is splitting that container of pesticides into smaller containers, which may have zero labeling.
Exactly.
There's also protective equipment that farmers should ideally wear when applying pesticides, also known as PPE. But countless studies suggest that in lower income countries, workers just aren't wearing PPE. That's because it's either unaffordable, inaccessible, or just inconvenient to wear given the kind of work they need to do.
They cannot use it because of the weather. The climate is very hot and humid, and sometimes it's also they find heat exhaustion, get dizzy and they have to sit down. They get a situation where they can't even breathe. It doesn't make sense if you have this pesticide that we are selling, but farmers are saying they cannot use the PPE.
One study of farm workers in India found that 99% of respondents weren't wearing protective equipment at all. Another study in Ethiopia had similar findings.
That pesticide that requires that PPE should be banned.
So if these chemicals are being traded between countries, then surely international agreements can protect ordinary folks, right? Well, yes and no. There are international treaties in place to regulate the trade of toxic chemicals, like the Stockholm and Rotterdam Conventions. But while the US has signed them, it hasn't ratified either one, meaning it's not fully bound by all the restrictions. And it can be exceptionally difficult to add new banned chemicals to those treaties, due in part to economic concerns and lobbying from both corporations and governments. Or take the fact that some of the world's most dangerous pesticides, like paraquat, are still not covered by either treaty as of 2024. Or the fact that the US recently stood in the way of an international ban on chlorpyrifos, a pesticide that had been banned in the US itself because it can cause irreversible brain damage in children, though that ban was challenged in an appeals court in 2023. So, the flow of dangerous pesticides into the world continues.
It is legal under the laws of the European Union, under the laws of the United States and other countries, and it is also legal under international regulatory instruments.
That's Marcus Oriana, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics.
This shows the shortcomings of international regulations that are intended to protect human health and yet allow what is an abhorrent practice of blatant double standards.
Lastly, there's the issue of prior informed consent. This is a key part of the Rotterdam Convention and US law. Basically, if a banned or unregistered pesticide is sent abroad, the country receiving it must at least consent to it beforehand. But there are major flaws. For one, various reports have suggested that the EPA is not following its own rules to inform countries receiving banned pesticides. There are numerous cases where countries have signed agreements banning the import of certain pesticides, but those countries still end up receiving the pesticide in question. Then there's the fact that lower income countries often don't have the same resources that rich countries do to assess the risk of every single toxic banned pesticide that enters their borders. And then what about all the people that are actually affected by these pesticides?
ऑक्सिजन हे लागल्यावर त्रास खूपच होत होता त्याला. ते पण लोक तसेच फवारणीचे लोकच 2-3 जण त्याला पकडायलाच लागे.
So it seems in all of this, the most powerless people are the ones that have no say, right? These pesticides are flying over and above their heads. They may not have the protective equipment, and then they're given this pesticide, they're shown that it works, and they use it. There's a power imbalance here.
The workers in the field of the global south pay the price for the profit of the corporations that produce the banned pesticides.
This is a double standard, just profit-based. You are sending this chemical for profit purpose, but these are killing our people.
So what does the pesticide industry have to say about all this? I spoke to Stella and Delisa at CropLife International, an organization that represents the biggest pesticide manufacturers in the world.
Experts we've spoken to tried to shine the light on this double standard. Why is it that a pesticide is unsafe for Europe? And why is it that Europe can continue to function? The US can continue to function with these pesticides banned?
If we take a narrow approach on what that standard is on human and environmental health, then yes, maybe there is a double standard. But again, are we really just confined to that one standard when we talk about agriculture? There are certain other highly hazardous pesticides that may be banned in a certain country for certain reasons that do not apply in another. We have to review the portfolio, and this is what CropLife companies are doing, looking at what are the alternatives available that would allow for that phase out.
Farmers are dying. There's 11,000 fatalities, and that's a minimum number per year that goes along with the 385 million unintentional acute poisonings of pesticides. This is a life and death situation. Why is that not enough of a cause to then bring the hammer down and say, look, this one, we can find an alternative to paraquat. There's alternatives to paraquat. Dozens of countries have banned it across different climates, and they're functioning just fine.
This is happening. This is happening in the different countries where they do the re-evaluation. If the data shows that this product cannot be managed, the product should be taken out. That is the standing and the position of CropLife.
Stella said that CropLife members in countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Tanzania are currently re-examining their use of certain highly hazardous pesticides. But both Stella and Delisa stress that removing a hazardous pesticide from use can't happen overnight because it involves a lot of players, considerations, and
complexity.
It's complex.
Policy consequences.
A multi-sectorial discussion, multi-agency interaction.
It is not straightforward.
It's not like the industry is holding the country at ransom and saying you must have this product. The country has leeway on what actions it should take on a product.
To highlight this complexity, they brought up the case of Sri Lanka. In 2021, Sri Lanka basically enacted an overnight ban of all chemical fertilizers and pesticide imports. It was part of a plan to go completely organic, but the experiment failed. Crop yields fell dramatically, an economic crisis ensued, and the country had to start importing rice to feed its population.
At first, it was highly praised and commended by the UN, but just within a year, the devastation it created demonstrates that it is not straightforward.
Afterwards, I put CropLife's arguments to Nathan Donley, an expert researcher who's been a vocal critic of US pesticide policy.
Their tactic really is fear. Fear that saving lives, protecting people from pesticides will somehow cause the economy to tank or their country to go into turmoil. It's nonsense.
Nathan said CropLife's use of Sri Lanka as an example is misleading. A sudden overnight ban on all pesticides would be disastrous for any country, let alone one that's so dependent on them.
No one's talking about banning all pesticides or getting rid of agriculture. We're talking about banning maybe a couple dozen of the worst pesticides out of hundreds. This is a small action that could have an enormous public health impact.
CropLife, they mentioned that, hey, this is the countries that are deciding that they want the pesticide. We're not holding a gun to them and saying, hey, take this pesticide.
What the industry does is they infiltrate the process, taking advantage of the fact that the governments in a lot of these countries are so underfunded, they're so under-resourced. We're seeing a lot of chatter between the pesticide industry and the regulators in the US. The government of Thailand ended up banning paraquat and chlorpyrifos, and the pesticide industry was really forceful on trying to use the clout of the US government to push back on that. The value of human life doesn't factor into the pesticide industry's positions.
So what's the solution to all this? Well, there was a lot of talk at the conference about switching the whole world onto agroecological farming methods. These can apparently have crop yields that are just as high, if not higher, without the use of pesticides. But until then, the US and the EU can at least make sure that something they deem unfit for their own populations isn't being deployed all over the world, and to poorer countries at that. That'll mean closing loopholes in EU law and substantially updating US laws for the first time in decades. So I don't know, it doesn't literally say, oh, it's completely fine if you export this banned/unregistered pesticide all over the world as long as you don't use it on Americans. It also means trying to remove business interests from the government, like ending the revolving door between government agencies and the pesticide industry. I mean, since 1974, all 7 of the US's top environment officials who did not retire after their term ended up working with the pesticide industry afterwards. And for the pesticide industry, it means ending this double standard. This false notion that highly hazardous pesticides that are banned in the US and the EU are absolutely needed to feed people all over the world.
The experience of Europe shows you that you can in fact ban those very toxic pesticides and still maintain a very good level of food and agricultural productivity.
And if there are alternatives in the north, those alternatives should be promoted also in the south rather than banning in your country and then exporting.
These are the pesticides that are doing the most harm. People are literally dying. They're developing chronic disease. They are losing their quality of life just so this industry can make a few bucks.